Orb of Creation has finally reached version 1.0, and if you haven't paid attention to this game yet, you might be missing out on one of the most addictive experiences within the incremental genre. At first glance, it looks simple. You start by creating basic resources, combining elements, and expanding your options. But the more you advance, the more the game opens up. That's where the deeper layer of optimization, automation, and decision-making that really impacts progress kicks in. So today, I've put together 10 advanced tips that can help you play more efficiently and better understand what the game demands at each stage. You might already know some of these, but there is definitely information here that can significantly ease your progress. I'm Mary, and the video is starting right now. One of the most important changes in version 1.0, and one that many people still haven't fully grasped, is how the game has become much more unpredictable. Now, the spells, glyphs, and artifacts you receive are completely random in every run. This completely changes how you need to approach the game. If you played a lot during early access, it's very likely you have a tendency to try and repeat the same build that worked before. But now, that simply doesn't work. The game isn't designed for you to force a specific path from the beginning. It practically forces you to play with what you are given. What started making a huge difference for me was pausing right at the start of the run and really analyzing the first glyphs and options the game gives me. Instead of ignoring them and trying to rush for a specific setup, I started asking myself, okay, what can I build with this right now? And when you get into that mindset, the game starts to flow much better. Orb of Creation has become much closer to a roguelike in this sense. Every run requires adaptation, analysis, and a bit of improvisation. And the sooner you accept this, the more consistent and even more fun your progress ends up being. If there's one thing I've learned from playing after the 1.0 launch, it's that capacity still rules the game, and by a lot. In the early and mid-game especially, prioritizing the expansion research line, specifically expert expansion, makes a massive difference in your progress. At the beginning, it might seem more interesting to invest in other areas that provide a more immediate return, but there comes a point where you simply can't advance because you lack space. Then everything starts to stall. Attributes don't rise, potions become limited, and several important technologies become inaccessible just because you don't have enough capacity. When I started focusing on this expansion line earlier, the game's pace changed completely. Suddenly, I had space to scale attributes more freely, test more combinations, and above all, stop hitting that invisible ceiling all the time. This is one of those classic tips, but it remains extremely strong in 1.0. If you feel like your progress is stalling for no clear reason, you can bet that capacity is the bottleneck, and solving this early saves a lot of time later. This is one of those mechanics that the game shows you, but doesn't explain the real impact it has on your progress. In Orb of Creation, understanding how multipliers work completely changes how you build your setup, especially when it comes to resource generation. The main point is bonuses of the same type add up additively. So for example, 2 plus 100% spell power bonuses become plus 200%. That seems strong, but it's nothing compared to what happens when you start mixing different categories. When you combine different types of multipliers, such as spell power with resource spell power, that's when the game starts to scale for real. Instead of just adding, they multiply with each other, creating those absurd peaks in resource generation, especially in click-focused builds. After I started paying attention to this, I stopped simply stacking the same type of bonus and started looking for smarter combinations. And that is where the game really opens up, because you move away from linear growth and enter a much more explosive progression, which accelerates everything else. This was one of the most interesting things I discovered while playing version 1.0 more deeply. The game sets a clear storage limit, but in practice, you can bypass it for a few moments, and that's where a huge opportunity for advancement lies. By using sequences of spells and potions, you can temporarily exceed your maximum resource limit. The bar goes beyond the normal cap, but with one important detail. This excess starts to drain over time. In other words, you have a short window to take advantage of this. And that is exactly where the strategy comes in. Instead of just hoarding for the sake of it, the ideal is to prepare everything beforehand, keep expensive upgrades in your sights, and when you exceed the limit, spend it all as fast as possible. If you do this well, you can grab upgrades that would normally take much longer to reach. After I started using this type of combo consciously, several parts of the progression became much faster. It's almost like cheating the system for a few seconds, but in a way that is totally intentional by the game. It just requires timing and a bit of planning. It took longer than I'd like to admit to realize that two apparently separate abilities in my inventory were actually talking to each other. Distorted Fusion and Condensed Time were always there, but for a good while, I used one without the other, thinking they were just two common late-game options. It was only when I started testing them properly that I saw what happened when they met. Distorted Fusion, on its own, has a clear function. It consumes resources in volume and converts everything into more valuable materials. Condensed Time accelerates the general pace of your processes, compressing production time. Each one solves a part of the puzzle, but neither solves the complete problem on its own. That's the trick. When you synchronize both, the game literally shifts gears. The accelerated consumption of distorted fusion gains the speed of condensed time, and suddenly you are generating dimensional cores and advanced materials on a scale that manual clicking could never reach. And the best part? This happens without locking your progression, because the combo creates a continuous flow instead of bottlenecks. If you are reaching that part of the game where farming manually feels like it leads nowhere, this is the turning point. That was exactly how I stopped hitting my head against the late-game walls and finally started moving forward again. Sometimes the solution isn't in a new ability, but in understanding that two you already have were meant to be used together. Alchemy and Orb of Creation seems simple at first, but it was one of the areas that changed how I play the most once I really understood how it scales. It's not just about creating recipes and letting them run. There is a huge difference between simply using a recipe and extracting the maximum from it. Basically, you have two main paths there, leveling up the recipe or stacking multiple copies of it. When you increase the level, production rises along with it, but the cost follows suit. It's a direct trade-off. More output, but requiring more of your base resources. Now, stacking is where things start to get interesting. When you stack the same recipe multiple times, you don't just increase production, you accelerate the entire process. Consumption becomes more intense, but in return, you create a much faster and more constant flow, which is perfect for keeping your economy spinning while you are focused on other parts of the game. What really flipped the switch for me was combining both things. It's not about choosing between level or quantity, it's about using both together in a balanced way. When you hit that spot, Alchemy stops being just a support and becomes one of the strongest progression tools in the game. The quick loadout swap shortcuts, especially Z and W, completely change the pace of your gameplay, especially when you already have several spell options unlocked. Before, I was constantly opening menus, manually adjusting builds depending on what I wanted to do, but that breaks the flow too much. When you understand that you can leave everything prepared in different loadouts and alternate with a key, the game becomes much more fluid. What worked best for me was clearly separating the functions. One loadout focused on long-duration buffs and passive generation, the one you activate and let run, and another entirely aimed at burst, with more expensive and stronger active spells. Then you just use W to alternate quickly depending on the moment, without needing to stop and think much. And Z comes in exactly as the base for all of this, because that's where you organize your builds and keep everything ready for this dynamic switch. After you get into the habit, it feels like you're playing a different game. Much faster, more efficient, and without that constant friction of messing with menus all the time. One thing that started to bother me quite a bit as I advanced was the cooldown time of spells that were outside the active loadout. On paper, it seemed fine to have several saved builds, but in practice, when I switched back to one of them, half of the spells were still on cooldown, and that totally ruined the rhythm. The problem is that the game does let these spells recharge in the bank, but at a much slower speed. So if you spend too much time focused on a single loadout, the others get a bit frozen, and when you need them, they aren't ready. That's when investing in parallel casting started to make perfect sense to me. This research completely changes this dynamic because it allows your secondary spells to better keep up with the game's pace even when you aren't using that loadout directly. After that, switching builds stopped being a risk and really became a strategic tool. You know you can alternate at any moment and still have your spells ready instead of waiting for cooldowns. It's a detail that seems small, but it greatly improves the consistency of your gameplay in the mid and late game. In the beginning, I played Orb of Creation almost entirely with the mouse, clicking on spells and going at whatever pace I could. It worked, but it always felt like I was one step behind what the game actually allowed me to do. The turnaround happened when I started to truly use the shortcuts, 1 through 9 for spells, QWER for items and consumables. It wasn't instant, but after a while, it became automatic. And then the game became much faster, much more fluid, without that feeling of hunting for buttons on the screen. The most interesting part is that this doesn't just improve speed, it completely changes how you think about your build. Instead of choosing loose abilities, you start to assemble sequences, like activating a buff and immediately slotting in a resource spell right after, all in a few seconds, almost like a combo. Today, for me, playing without using hotkeys even feels wrong, because when you get used to it, you realize that a good part of the game's potential lies precisely in this fast execution. It's not just about having the best abilities, it's about being able to use everything at the right timing. This change in attribute ranks in version 1.0 caught a lot of people off guard, and it was no different for me. At the beginning, I kept playing the same way, distributing coins into various attributes at the same time, until I realized that the cost was starting to get completely out of control. Every 50 levels, you gain a rank that actually increases the power of that attribute. But along with that comes an important detail. The cost scales exponentially, and that's where the danger lies. If you try to evolve everything at the same time, you will quickly run out of resources to sustain this growth. What started to work much better for me was focusing on 1 or 2 main attributes at the start of the run. This allows you to reach those rank ups faster and extract real value from them, instead of ending up with several mediocre attributes that don't really go anywhere. And keep an eye out especially when you start reaching that 150 to 200 level range. That is the point where the scaling starts to explode for real. If you aren't prepared or are investing in a scattered way, progress slows down a lot. Knowing when to focus and when to stop makes all the difference here.
So keep your head on your shoulders. Now we ain't out here moving rocks. We out here moving boulders. Now we ain't